Tunisian police have clashed with protesters near the chamber of the suspended parliament as demonstrators marched against President Kais Saied's seizure of political power 4 months ago. Hundreds of police had blocked off the area where thousands of protesters were gathering on Sunday to demand that Saied restore the parliament and normal democratic rule. Increasingly vocal opposition, along with a looming crisis in public finances, may pose a new test of how Mr. Saied and the new government he has appointed will tackle threats to the authority. President Saied seized nearly all powers in July, suspending the parliament and dismissing the government in a move his critics call a coup, before installing a new prime minister and announcing he could rule by decree. An African Affairs Analyst, Amuda Mosigbodi, joins me on the news to discuss this. Good to have you join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, President Saied was the poster child of the Arab Spring in 2011, and so much was expected of him in terms of restoring democratic rule to that country and helping to navigate through the economic crisis. But let me just ask you, because now we're seeing a lot of protests on the streets of Tunisia, is that country returning to its old despotic order, or is some sort of authoritarian rule now being born?
If you understand what happened in Tunisia as well as in other Arab countries during the Arab Spring, which I would not want to call it a revolution, but which some people have chosen to call a revolution, what we saw happen was a regime change. And so it was a change from one political party to another political party. Now, what does that mean? It means that the major institutions that sustained despotism and dictatorship within the system were still there. It was just that the occupiers of these respective institutions only switched, situations. And so what we had, if I may borrow Amika Cabra's word, was just a change of the landlords of the different institutions. So for what is happening in Tunisia now, what many are seeing is shocking to them, because they feel that a Said should come, for someone who was deeply involved in the whole struggle, of the Arab Spring, and now becoming or tilting towards dictatorship. It is quite shocking for them. But then, as we always say, this is something that has been there. If you had seen what's played out, one would not be surprised that this is happening in Tunisia. But don't also forget that Tunisia has always had this long history with dictators. From from when it gained its independence from France in the 50s to when Ben Ali came on, and even post 2011, it's been from one person who feels that the way towards development in Tunisia is dictatorship to another. So it's not a shocking thing. I think it's a route that Tunisians themselves are familiar with, and with the fight against these dictators is also a route they are familiar with as well.
And absolutely, I do agree with you about the dictatorship in the country, but in the wake of the Arab Spring, after Omar al-Bashir was toppled, rather, sorry, not Omar al-Bashir, but in the wake of the Arab Spring, when President Saied rather took power in that country, people were expecting, dialogue started, and people were expecting that, the politics in that country will be founded on some level of dialogue. And people have been expecting negotiations to begin after President Saied suspended parliament, but that hasn't happened. What sort of message do you think he's trying to send to the people?
The message is simple. The path towards total or full democratization is or should not be anchored on person. It should rather be anchored on institutions. What we saw play out, or is playing out in Tunisia is still coming back to what Barack Obama said in his visit to Africa then, that what Africa needs are not strong men but strong institutions. I've always argued that we need both strong men and strong institutions. But then what we have been doing is to emphasize the strong men against strong institutions. See, if you bring angels, and that's the reality, if you bring angels to government and they see that there is a way they can wrestle power to themselves. See, power naturally is just something that corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there will be that penchant to want to gain power, to acquire more power to themselves, and that is what is playing out. For anyone who is surprised at what is happening in Tunisia at the moment, they should understand that when you don't build the needed viral institutions, and you are only building, individuals, you are building your democracy on individuals. Well, the result of what would happen is what we are seeing in Tunisia at the moment.
Absolutely. We need strong men to man the strong institutions so that we can continue to sustain democratic order in every country. But let's look at what's happening in Tunisia now. Can the President Saied sustain this kind of governance without public support, without political support? And how long can he do this for? How long can he sustain without legal or constitutional protection? Again, from the parliament.
Well, the reality is, his presidency is futile and baseless when the political legitimacy is absent, and that is the people's support. Now, in this case, we have seen that this government has lost that legitimacy. So it must seek every means possible to ensure that it wins back the popular support. And that's it's going to be a major order. I do not see him surviving this. Don't forget that Tunisians are known to be very, very solid when it comes to pushing through their demands and ensuring that their desires. And now again, we are seeing even from our presidents lending support to this protest. So telling you that it is still a fight of one political class trying to oust another political class. And when that is the case, it means that such demonstrations have strong base. And when they have a strong base like that, which gives them the needed backing, they will not back down in any good time. So I do not see him surviving this. Maybe the only way he would survive this is to resign his decision.
Some section of the country, and by section I mean political parties and activists, are calling for a national dialogue, but there are another section again made up of political parties as well and activists calling for fresh legislative elections. And they say that, look, this parliament that was suspended didn't do anything to help alleviate the situation, especially economic crisis in the country. What do you think can restore democratic order and constitutional order, rather, to that country?
Well, the truth is, the way forward would be fresh parliamentary elections. But let's be frank here, if fresh parliamentary elections are conducted, then you can be sure that Saied's party is going out. That's very sure, because there is already popular anger against the political party. So they are going to lose so many parliamentary seats. Now, calling for a national dialogue would also mean that, yes, Saied's party is going to control the base. Now, so when you see these two, arguments coming from the two sides, they are actually vested interests. And, this interest is what drives the suggestions coming from. But for me, I think the way forward would be definitely calling for new party, because he's the one that definitely sees powers, and there's a need to have a fresh parliament to drive, the wheel of democracy in that country. Unfortunately, it would mean that Saied will be taken to the cleaners.
So let me ask you just in general, because what we're seeing now in Tunisia is almost the same thing as what we're seeing in Sudan. Sudan is an outright coup. What's happening in Tunisia has also been called a coup, but it wasn't an outright coup, as it were, in terms of military involvement. But let's talk about strong men and strong institutions you talked about earlier. Can you be a strong man? And because again, people say that democracy, we heard that President Buhari made that statement earlier, how slow the democratic process can be because of processes. Can you be a strong man operating within the ambits of the law in a democracy without having to suspend parliament and the judiciary and get things done?
Now, you've asked a serious question. I was going through one of my old, write-ups, and where I tried to talk about the continuous clash between freedom and growth, particularly in Africa. Yes, they are not mutually exclusive, but then can we really sustain growth in Africa while we still maintain that level of freedom. That for me, I think is quite difficult. But then, if you are also someone coming on the use of democracy, you should have your mind prepared. You should not try to supplant the system that you found yourself. And I think that's quite preposterous, if not dangerous, for you to think that you can supplant the system. Now, if there are problems within the system, you can drive a needed constitutional change. Yes, it will come at a slow pace, but then that can be done. Now, do you need to suspend institutions here, trying to override some institutions there? Now, how are we sure? Because the question of judging accurately the intentions of people is going to be a problem. How do we know what your intentions are? How do we, say that, or how can we say that your intentions are actually noble? If your intentions are noble, what happens to the double outcome theory, tragedy, where your intentions may be noble, but the result is not? So how do we manage that? These and many others are a lot of philosophical problems, that will come up. But I think what leaders across the world can do, when you come on the use of democracy, you can use the parliament to drive it. Now, if the parliament cannot drive it, then there is always a place of the people. Win mass support of the people. And that's one thing about, populism. Populism, which has been of course, we've seen how it has been the bane of war from the US to what we saw in Canada under Trudeau, to Boris in the UK and the likes. How populism has become a danger to us. But then you can also ride on the use of populism to drive the needed systemic change. But the problem has always been that these individuals always have their own selfish interests at the core of such moves. And so when they have their selfish interests, it becomes difficult to really make the needed drive to affect the
and
needed
that's
change.
where I was going to go to, because again, we see populism thriving in some parts of Europe and working well. Democracy seems to be thriving in some parts of the world and working well. And we hear every day people saying, especially again, I'm focusing on what's happening in Tunisia and in Sudan, some parts in Mali, in Guinea, and people say Africa needs to find its own kind of democracy. Do we need to really start to look for our own kind of democracy, or is just really the people who are handling the process of democracy that's the problem?
Well, the truth is, it seems like a kind of a theoretical hamstringing when we try to constrict democracy into just one jacket. Now, democracy as practiced in the countries will differ, and the reason is this: our historical backgrounds differ, our experiences differ, and so each country would have to evolve its democracy. Now, if you bring a Westphalian democracy to Nigeria or to Sudan, for instance, then you can be sure that you're going to fail. Now, democracy as practiced in a homogeneous country may not work well in a heterogeneous country. So you must try to find your own, evolve something that will be what I'll call maybe homegrown with a bit of what is there. But the fundamental thing is ensure that the freedom of people is protected, which is quite fundamental here. And following that argument that you said, that Africa, or even the world as a whole, needs to evolve. Every country has to evolve its own style of democracy. It's not straitjacketed, and I think that's something we must understand. It's not necessarily straitjacketed. Let people agree what their own democracy is, what their own definition of democracy is. If you say your democracy, for instance, is government of the people, government of the majority by the minority for the majority, well, good if it's something that suits you. Or if you say that your own democracy is government of the majority by the majority for the minority, well and good if that is what suits your system. But essentially, because it is you that knows, that know better where the shoe pinches. Now, someone in the UK, someone in Washington cannot tell you where the shoe pinches in Tunisia. Someone in London cannot tell you where the shoe pinches in Khartoum. So we must come up with our own homegrown system that suits our environment and, of course, can engender development.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and insight, as always. African Affairs Analyst Amuda Mosigbodi.